The cold wind howled across the barren land, carrying tiny ice particles that stung Ryan's face like needles. He pulled his coat tighter around his body as he trudged through the snow-covered valley. This alien planet was harsh, its icy landscape unforgiving. His ship had crash-landed here, and now he was walking toward the faint signal of a possible shelter. As he walked, something caught his eye in the distance. A figure was slumped against a jagged rock. At first, he thought it was just debris from his ship. But as he got closer, he saw it wasn't metal. It was a person, or rather, something that looked like a person. The figure was an alien woman, her silver skin shimmering faintly under the pale light of the planet's twin moons. She was shivering uncontrollably, her knees pulled to her chest, and her long, silvery hair was matted with frost. Her glowing eyes were half closed, and she looked like she was barely clinging to life. Ryan froze for a moment. His instincts told him to keep walking. He didn't know anything about this creature. She could be dangerous. She could be a trap. But then he noticed the raw desperation in her face, the way her hands trembled as she tried to pull her tattered clothing tighter around her. "Hey!" Ryan called out, his voice carried by the wind. The alien flinched at the sound, her head snapping up to look at him. Her eyes widened, filled with fear and mistrust. Ryan raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said slowly. He wasn't even sure if she could understand him, but he hoped his tone would get the message across. The alien woman didn't respond. Instead, she tried to crawl away from him, but she was too weak. Her arms gave out, and she collapsed back into the snow. Ryan sighed. He knew he couldn't just leave her here. If he did, she wouldn't last the night. He carefully approached her, pulling off his jacket. The icy wind bit into him immediately, but he ignored it. He draped the jacket over her shoulders. The alien stiffened at his touch, her glowing eyes staring at him as if he had just done something unthinkable. "You're freezing," Ryan said, even though he knew she probably didn't understand. "This'll help." For a moment, she just stared at him, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but didn't know how. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the wind, she whispered, "Why? Help." Ryan was taken aback. She could speak his language, or at least some of it. "Because you need it," he replied simply. "You're going to die out here if you don't get warm." Her expression was one of disbelief. It was as if she couldn't understand the idea of someone helping her without expecting something in return. She clutched the jacket tightly around her shoulders, her silver fingers gripping the fabric like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Ryan crouched down to her level. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated before answering, her voice shaky. "Lyria." "Lyria," he repeated. "I'm Ryan. Can you stand?" She shook her head, her eyes lowering in shame. "Too weak," she admitted. Ryan looked around. The landscape was desolate, and the temperature was dropping fast. They wouldn't survive out here much longer. He knew he couldn't carry her far, but he had seen a rocky outcrop in the distance that might offer some shelter. "I'll carry you," he said, slipping his arms under her and lifting her up. She was surprisingly light, her fragile frame weighing almost nothing in his arms. As he started walking toward the outcrop, Lyria clung to him weakly. She seemed torn between gratitude and fear. "You? Not like others," she murmured. "What do you mean?" Ryan asked, glancing down at her. But before she could answer, a distant howl cut through the air. It was low and guttural, sending a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Lyria's body stiffened in his arms. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. Ryan's heart began to race. "Who's coming?" he demanded, but Lyria didn't answer. She was trembling, her glowing eyes darting around as if she expected something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. The howling grew louder, and Ryan realized it wasn't just one creature, it was many. The sound was coming from multiple directions, echoing across the icy plains. Whatever was out there, it was hunting them. "We need to move," Ryan said, quickening his pace. He didn't know what was chasing them, but he knew he didn't want to find out. As they reached the rocky outcrop, Ryan found a small crevice barely big enough for the two of them. He set Lyria down inside and pulled out his survival knife, his only weapon. The howling was getting closer now, and he could see shapes moving in the fog. Lyria grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong despite her weakness. "They will kill you," she said, her voice urgent. "You should leave me." Ryan shook his head. "Not happening," he said firmly. "I'm not leaving you." Lyria stared at him, her glowing eyes wide with shock. No one had ever said those words to her before. As the howls grew deafening, she whispered, "You are different." Ryan held his knife tightly, preparing for whatever was coming. "Yeah," he muttered, his eyes scanning the fog. "And I hope that's enough." The escape begins. The storm had worsened, and the howls were closing in. Inside the narrow crevice, Ryan tightened his grip on the survival knife. His breath came out in sharp puffs of mist, and every muscle in his body was tense. Lyria sat huddled in his jacket, her silver skin faintly glowing in the dim light. She was trembling, not just from the cold, but from fear. Outside, the shapes in the fog became clearer. They were tall, hunched creatures with sleek black bodies and glowing red eyes. Their movements were predatory, deliberate. Ryan counted at least 5 of them, prowling just beyond the outcrop. He glanced at Lyria, who was staring at the creatures with wide, terrified eyes. "What are they?" he whispered. Lyria's voice was barely audible. "Hunters. They come for me." "Why?" Ryan demanded, keeping his voice low. He had 100 questions, but the urgency in Lyria's expression told him there wasn't time for answers. "They want what I am," she said cryptically. Her voice cracked as she added, "They will not stop." Ryan swallowed hard. The odds were bad. He was outnumbered, unarmed except for a knife, and carrying an injured alien who was clearly their target. Staying here wasn't an option. They had to move. "Can you walk?" he asked her, his voice steady despite the panic gnawing at the edges of his mind. Lyria shook her head weakly. "Not far." "Then I'll carry you again," he said. Before she could protest, he hoisted her into his arms. She clung to him tightly, her glowing eyes fixed on the creatures outside. Ryan took a deep breath and stepped out of the crevice. The icy wind bit into his exposed skin, but he ignored it. He kept low, moving carefully through the rocky terrain. The creatures hadn't noticed them yet, but that wouldn't last long. Suddenly, one of the hunters let out a sharp, piercing screech. Ryan's blood ran cold as all 5 creatures turned toward them. Their glowing red eyes locked onto Lyria, and they began to sprint. "Hold on," Ryan shouted, breaking into a run. The snow was deep, and every step felt like a battle, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Lyria clung to him, her weak voice barely audible over the howling wind. "This way," she gasped, pointing toward a faint light in the distance. Ryan didn't question her. He adjusted his direction, heading toward what he hoped was safety. The hunters were fast, faster than any human. Ryan could hear their guttural growls getting closer, the sound of their claws scraping against the ice. He didn't dare look back. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, his lungs burning with every breath. Ahead, the light grew brighter, revealing the outline of a structure. It was an old, abandoned outpost, half buried in snow and ice. Ryan's heart leaped. If they could make it inside, they might have a chance. The creatures were almost on them now. Ryan could feel the ground vibrating under their weight. Just as he reached the outpost, one of the hunters lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. Ryan spun at the last second, narrowly avoiding the attack. He kicked the creature in the chest, sending it sliding across the ice. "Go, go," Lyria urged, her voice trembling with fear. Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He dashed inside the outpost, slamming the heavy metal door shut behind them. The creatures pounded on the door, their screeches echoing through the small building. Ryan quickly found a metal beam and wedged it across the door, securing it as best he could. Breathing heavily, he turned to Lyria. She was slumped against the wall, her silver skin dimmer than before. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She nodded weakly. "For now." Ryan took a moment to survey their surroundings. The outpost was small, just one room with rusted walls and broken equipment scattered everywhere. It didn't look like anyone had been here in years. The only source of light came from a flickering panel on the far wall. "What is this place?" Ryan asked, helping Lyria sit up. "Old station," she said. "Not safe for long." As if to prove her point, the pounding on the door grew louder. The hunters were relentless, their claws scraping against the metal. Ryan knew it was only a matter of time before they found a way in. "Do they ever give up?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. Lyria shook her head. "Not until they have me." Ryan's mind raced. He needed a plan, something to buy them more time. His eyes landed on the flickering panel. "What about that? Can we use it to call for help?" Lyria hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe, but risky. It will tell them where we are." Ryan frowned. "They already know where we are." Lyria met his gaze, her glowing eyes filled with uncertainty. "If we call, others might come too. Worse than hunters." Ryan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He didn't know who these others were, but they didn't sound like allies. Still, it was better than sitting here, waiting to be torn apart. "We don't have a choice," he said firmly. "If there's a chance, we have to take it." Lyria hesitated, then slowly nodded. Ryan moved to the panel, his hands shaking slightly as he activated it. The screen buzzed to life, and a strange language filled the air. Lyria leaned against him, her voice weak as she translated the symbols. As they worked, the pounding on the door turned into a deafening crash. The hunters were breaking through. Ryan's heart pounded as he turned to Lyria. "How much time?" Her eyes met his, filled with both fear and determination. "Not enough." The metal door began to buckle, and Ryan gripped his knife, preparing for the fight of his life. Trust is a fragile thing. The old outpost was no longer safe. The hunters had broken through the door, forcing Ryan and Lyria to flee through a hidden tunnel they found beneath the crumbling floor. The narrow passage was pitch black, the air thick with dampness and decay. The only sound was their hurried footsteps and Lyria's ragged breathing as Ryan helped her move forward. They didn't know where the tunnel led, but it was better than staying behind to face the hunters. Ryan kept one arm around Lyria to steady her and held his knife tightly in the other. His thoughts raced as he tried to figure out their next move. How long could they keep running? The tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The dim glow of bioluminescent moss on the walls revealed that they were in some kind of underground cavern. The ceiling was high, dripping with icicles that sparkled faintly in the low light. In the center of the cavern stood a figure, tall, armored, and imposing. Ryan froze, pulling Lyria behind him. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. The figure turned slowly, revealing the humanoid face partially obscured by a sleek, black visor. The stranger was heavily armed, with a plasma rifle slung over their back and various gadgets strapped to their armor. They raised their hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Relax," the stranger said, their voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Ryan didn't lower his knife. "Then what are you doing here?" The strangers stepped closer, their boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. "Tracking the same things you're running from," they said. "The hunters." Lyria tensed behind Ryan, clutching his jacket tightly. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. The stranger's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, they seemed to hesitate. "Because they're after something valuable," they said finally. "And I'm guessing that's you." Ryan's grip on his knife tightened. "If you're here to take her, you'll have to go through me." The stranger tilted their head, as if amused. "Brave. Stupid, but brave." They reached up and removed their visor, revealing sharp, angular features and piercing gray eyes. "I'm not your enemy. Name's Cal. I'm a bounty hunter. But for now, I'm willing to help you." Ryan frowned, his instincts screaming not to trust Cal. Why would a bounty hunter want to help us? Cal shrugged. "Because I don't like the hunters any more than you do. And because I have a score to settle with their boss." Lyria stepped out from behind Ryan, her glowing eyes narrowed. "You mean Verin," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. Cal nodded. "That's the one. He's been hunting your kind for years, enslaving them, selling them, experimenting on them. He's a monster." Ryan glanced at Lyria, who looked down, her hands trembling. "Is that true?" he asked softly. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Verin is why I ran, why they hunt me." Ryan's mind reeled. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Lyria was part of something much bigger, something dangerous. He looked back at Cal. "If you want to help, how do we know we can trust you?" Cal smirked. "You don't. But let me put it this way. Without me, you're not making it out of this cavern alive. The hunters aren't far behind, and this tunnel system is a maze. I've been through it before. I can get you out." Ryan hesitated. He didn't like the idea of trusting a bounty hunter, but Cal had a point. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely lost. He glanced at Lyria, who was staring at Cal with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Your call," Cal said, crossing their arms. "But you don't have much time." The distant sound of growls echoed through the tunnel, and Ryan made his decision. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "We'll go with you. But if you try anything, you'll regret it." Cal chuckled. "Fair enough. Let's move." The bounty hunter led them through the cavern, navigating the winding tunnels with ease. Ryan stayed close to Lyria, who was growing weaker with every step. She leaned on him for support, her breaths shallow and uneven. "You okay?" Ryan asked, his voice low. Lyria nodded, but her expression said otherwise. "I'll manage," she whispered. Cal glanced back at them. "She doesn't look good," they said. "If we don't find a place to rest soon, she won't make it." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Then we move faster." The group emerged into another cavern, this one smaller but filled with strange machinery that hummed faintly with power. Cal stopped and turned to face them. "We can rest here for a bit," they said. "But don't get too comfortable. The hunters will catch up eventually." Ryan helped Lyria sit down against the wall. She closed her eyes, her silver skin dimming even further. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Cal knelt beside her, studying her closely. "You're not just any runaway, are you?" they said. "You're something special. That's why Verin wants you so badly." Lyria didn't respond. Ryan stepped between them, his eyes hard. "Back off," he warned. Cal raised their hands. "Relax, I'm just making an observation. If we're going to survive this, I need to know what we're dealing with." Ryan didn't trust Cal, but he couldn't deny they were right. Whatever Lyria was hiding, it was the key to understanding why they were being hunted and how to fight back. The sound of distant growls returned, louder this time. Cal stood, their expressions serious. "Rest time's over," they said. "They're here." Ryan helped Lyria to her feet, his grip on his knife tightening. "Let's go." As they moved deeper into the tunnels, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But with the hunters closing in, he had no choice but to follow Cal and hope they weren't leading him to his doom. A battle for freedom. The cavern was cold, dark, and eerily silent, save for the faint hum of alien machinery hidden in the shadows. Ryan gripped his survival knife tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Lyria leaned against him, her glowing eyes dimming more with every passing moment. Cal, the bounty hunter, stood ahead, scanning the cavern with their visor back on, the faint red glow from its HUD casting sharp reflections on the ice. "We're running out of options," Cal muttered. They tapped a small device on their wrist, a holographic map springing to life. "The hunters will be here in minutes. If we don't act now, we're dead." Ryan glanced at Lyria. She was barely holding on, her silver skin pale and cracked. He knew they couldn't keep running. Not in her condition. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Cale hesitated, then pointed toward a bulky piece of machinery embedded in the far wall. "That's a power node. If we overload it, we can collapse this part of the cavern. It'll block the hunters long enough for us to escape." "And the downside?" Ryan asked, already bracing himself for bad news. Cale sighed. "The blast will draw every hunter in the area straight to us." Ryan clenched his jaw. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only one they had. He looked at Lyria again, her weak form trembling as she tried to stay upright. "Can you do it?" he asked Cale. "Of course," Cale said, almost offended by the question. "But I'll need time. Keep them off me while I work." Before Ryan could respond, the air filled with a deep guttural growl. The hunters had arrived. The first hunter leaked into the cavern, its sleek black body blending almost perfectly with the shadows. Its glowing red eyes locked onto Lyria, and it let out a piercing screech that sent a shiver down Ryan's spine. Without thinking, Ryan stepped forward, placing himself between the creature and Lyria. "Stay behind me," he told her, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. The hunter lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Ryan ducked just in time, the creature's claws narrowly missing his head. He countered with a slash of his own, his knife cutting across the hunter's arm. It let out a snarl, its blood, thick and black, spattering onto the icy ground. Cale was already at the power node, their fingers flying over the controls. "I need 5 minutes," they shouted. 5 minutes, Ryan barked, dodging another attack. "We don't have 5 minutes." More hunters poured into the cavern, their glowing eyes and sharp claws filling the space with an overwhelming sense of danger. Ryan fought with everything he had, his movements fueled by adrenaline and desperation. He managed to take down one of the creatures, but they just kept coming. Lyria, meanwhile, was struggling to stay conscious. She watched Ryan fight, her heart sinking with every blow he took. She knew he couldn't hold them off forever. Summoning what little strength she had, she reached out and touched a nearby control panel. The machine buzzed to life, and faint energy crackled around her fingertips. Ryan glanced back at her, his eyes widening. "Lyria, what are you doing?" Her voice was faint but determined. "Helping." Suddenly, a burst of energy shot from the panel, striking one of the hunters. The creature let out a deafening screech before collapsing to the ground. Lyria swayed, the effort clearly taking a toll on her, but she kept going, using the machinery around her to attack the hunters. Cale glanced over their shoulder, impressed. "Not bad," they muttered, before returning their focus to the power node. "Just a little longer." Ryan fought alongside Lyria's energy bursts, the two of them managing to hold the hunters at bay. But the creatures were relentless. One of them managed to slip past Ryan's defenses, its claws aiming straight for Lyria. "No," Ryan shouted, throwing himself in front of her. The hunter's claws raked across his side, and he cried out in pain, but he didn't back down. He drove his knife into the creature's chest, forcing it to the ground. Lyria gasped, her glowing eyes filling with tears. You're hurt." "I'm fine," Ryan said through gritted teeth, though the pain was excruciating. "Just focus on staying alive." Cal's voice cut through the chaos. "It's done. Get ready to run." The power node began to hum loudly, its energy building to a dangerous level. Cal sprinted toward Ryan and Lyria, grabbing a small detonator from their belt. "When this goes off, this whole cavern's coming down. We need to move now." Ryan helped Lyria to her feet, her weight heavy against him. The three of them bolted for the far end of the cavern, the hunters right on their heels. Cal hit the detonator, and the power node erupted in a blinding explosion. The cavern shook violently, massive chunks of ice and rock crashing down around them. Ryan pushed forward, his body screaming in protest as he carried Lyria. Kale led the way, their visor scanning for a safe path. They barely made it out before the cavern collapsed completely, the entrance sealing behind them. The sound of the explosion faded, leaving only silence and the faint hum of the wind. Ryan collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Lyria slumped against him, her silver skin dull and cracked. Kale leaned against a wall, their armor scorched but intact. "Well," Kale said, their voice dripping with sarcasm. "That was fun." Ryan shot them a glare, but didn't respond. His focus was on Lyria, who was barely conscious. "We need to find somewhere safe," he said, his voice hoarse. Kale nodded. "There's a ship not far from here. If we can get to it, we might stand a chance." Ryan looked down at Lyria, her glowing eyes half closed. He didn't know how much more she could take, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't giving up on her. A desperate gamble. The air inside the crashed alien ship was stale, heavy with the scent of burnt metal and decay. Ryan helped Lyria onto a worn-out chair in what seemed to be the cockpit, her fragile body barely able to hold itself up. Her glowing silver skin was dimmer than ever, cracks spreading across it like a spiderweb. She looked as though she might shatter at any moment. Kale moved quickly through the ship, flipping switches and muttering curses under their breath. "This ship is ancient," they grumbled, "barely functional, and most of the systems are fried." Ryan ignored Cal's complaints, focusing instead on Lyria. "You need to rest," he said softly. "We'll get out of here. Just hang on." Lyria shook her head weakly. "They won't stop. Not until they have me." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a grim truth. Ryan knelt beside her, his expression firm. "We'll stop them. I don't care what it takes." Kale snorted from the other side of the cockpit. "Big words, hero. But unless you got a miracle hidden in that jacket of yours, I wouldn't get too confident. Those hunters will find us soon enough." Ryan stood, his frustration boiling over. "Then what's your plan? Keep running until they catch us." Kale turned, their gray eyes narrowing. "No, we fight. But not like this." They pointed at Lyria. "She's the key. Whatever it is they want from her, she can use it against them." Lyria looked up, her glowing eyes filled with fear. "I can't. I don't know how." "You don't have to," Kale said, their voice softening slightly. "I've seen what your kind can do. You've got abilities they fear, right? Powers they want to control." Lyria hesitated, then nodded. "But it hurts. It takes everything." Ryan's fists clenched. "We're not using her as some kind of weapon. She's barely alive as it is." Kale raised an eyebrow. "And what's your alternative? Let them drag her back to their boss. Let her suffer for the rest of her life." Lyria's voice cut through the argument, weak but steady. "I'll do it." Ryan turned to her, his heart sinking. "Lyria, no, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she said, her voice firmer now. "They'll never stop. Not until I make them." Kale nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. But we're going to need a plan." The plan. The three of them gathered around the ship's control panel, its screen flickering weakly. Kale brought up a map of the surrounding area. "The hunters are closing in on us, but they're not the only ones we need to worry about. Their boss, Varen, is sending reinforcements." Ryan frowned. "Reinforcements? How many?" Kale shrugged. "Enough to make this a suicide mission if we don't act fast. But there's a way to turn this around." They pointed at a glowing dot on the map. "This is the central hub for their tracking systems. If we can overload it, we'll blind them, at least for a while. That'll give us the time we need to escape." "And how do we overload it?" Ryan asked. Kale glanced at Lyria. "Her." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Absolutely not." "She's the only one who can do it," Kale insisted. "Her abilities can disrupt their tech. It's risky, but it's our best shot." Lyria nodded slowly. "I'll do it." Ryan looked at her, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and admiration. "Lyria, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she said, cutting him off. "This ends now." The execution. The journey to the central hub was brutal. The hunters were everywhere, their screeches echoing through the icy landscape. Kale led the way, their plasma rifle cutting down any creature that got too close. Ryan stayed close to Lyria, his knife ready and his heart pounding. When they finally reached the hub, it was a massive structure buried in the ice, its spires glowing with ominous red light. The air around it buzzed with energy, making the hairs on Ryan's neck stand on end. "This is it," Kale said, scanning the area. "We'll hold them off while she works. Ryan, stay close to her." Ryan nodded, his grip on his knife tightening. "You don't have to tell me twice." Lyria approached the central console, her hands trembling as she placed them on the cold metal. The machinery buzzed to life, and a surge of energy shot through her, making her cry out in pain. "Lyria!" Ryan shouted, stepping toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I'm fine," she said through gritted teeth. "Just keep them away." The hunters arrived moments later, their red eyes glowing in the darkness. Kale opened fire, their plasma rifle lighting up the night. Ryan stood in front of Lyria, slashing at any creature that got too close. Lyria's glow intensified, her silver skin radiating light as she poured her energy into the console. The ground began to shake, and the spires of the hub flickered wildly. "I can't hold them much longer," Kale shouted, reloading their rifle. "We're almost there," Lyria said, her voice strained. "Just a little more." Ryan fought harder, his movements fueled by desperation. He wouldn't let them take her, not after everything they'd been through. Suddenly, the hub let out a deafening roar, and a wave of energy exploded outward, knocking everyone to the ground. The hunters screeched in agony, their bodies disintegrating in the light. When the dust settled, Ryan crawled to Lyria's side. She was unconscious, her glow completely gone. "Lyria," he said, shaking her gently. "Lyria, wake up." She didn't respond. Kale approached, their visor cracked but intact. "She did it," they said, their voice quiet. "The system's down. They can't track us anymore." Ryan didn't care about the hub. He cared about Lyria. "Is she?" Kale knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "She's alive." "Barely." Ryan let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. "We need to get her out of here." Kale nodded. "Agreed. But this isn't over. Varin won't stop. Not after this." Ryan lifted Lyria into his arms, his expression hard. "Then we'll be ready." As they walked away from the destroyed hub, the horizon began to glow with the faint light of dawn. It was a small victory, but the battle was far from over. The final stand. The stolen alien ship hummed weakly as it soared low over the icy landscape, its engine sputtering with exhaustion. Ryan sat in the cockpit, gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity. Every warning light on the dashboard was blinking, a constant reminder of how close they were to losing everything. Behind him, Kale worked furiously at the navigation console, their armored fingers flying over the controls. And in the corner, Lyria lay motionless on a makeshift bed of thermal blankets. Her silver skin was dull, her once vibrant glow now a faint flicker. She looked fragile, almost translucent, as if she were fading away. "We don't have much time," Ryan muttered, his voice tight with urgency. "How long until Varin's forces catch up to us?" Kale glanced at a small monitor, their expression grim. "They're already closing in. 3 ships on an intercept course, and one of them's a warship." Ryan cursed under his breath. "How are we supposed to fight a warship in this scrap heap?" Kale smirked, though it didn't reach their eyes. "We're not, but we can make them regret underestimating us." From the back of the ship, a faint voice broke through the tension. "No, you can't fight them." Ryan turned to see Lyria stirring, her glowing eyes barely open. She looked at him, her gaze filled with both fear and determination. "But I can." Ryan moved to her side, kneeling next to her. "Lyria. No. You've done enough. You're barely hanging on." Her hand reached out, trembling, and rested on his arm. "If we don't stop them here, they'll never stop. You save me, Ryan. Let me save you." Kale interrupted, their tone sharp. "If she's got a plan, now's the time to hear it. Those ships will be in firing range in less than 5 minutes. Lyria took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. "They want me because of what I am. My energy, it can disrupt their systems, overload them. But it's dangerous. It will take everything I have." Ryan's chest tightened. He shook his head. "No, I won't let you do this." Kale stepped forward, their voice cutting through the moment. "Look, hero, I get it. You want to protect her. But if she doesn't do this, we're all dead. Sometimes saving someone means letting them make the hard choice." Ryan glared at Kale, but didn't argue. He turned back to Lyria, his voice soft. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her glowing eyes meeting his. "I'm sure." The ambush. The alien warship appeared on the horizon, its massive form blotting out the faint light of the twin suns. 2 smaller escort ships flanked it, their sleek designs gleaming menacingly. Ryan's stomach churned as the warship's weapons began to glow, preparing to fire. Kale leaned over the console, activating the ship's meager defensive systems. "I've got flares, countermeasures, and that's about it. This is gonna be ugly." Ryan stood beside Lyria, helping her to her feet. "Tell me what to do," he said. "How can I help you?" She smiled faintly, her voice barely audible. "Just stay close." Lyria moved to the center of the ship, placing her hands on the cold metal floor. Her body began to glow, brighter and brighter, as she tapped into the energy that made her so valuable and so dangerous. The ship's interior lights flickered, and the air crackled with static. Kale whistled softly. "Impressive. Let's hope it's enough." The warship fired its first volley, a barrage of plasma bolts streaking toward them. Kale deployed the countermeasures, the flares exploding in brilliant bursts that deflected most of the shots. But one bolt struck the ship's side, sending it lurching violently. Ryan caught Lyria before she fell, steadying her. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her glow was already starting to dim. "I need to release the energy. Soon." Kale shouted from the cockpit. "You better do it fast. They're lining up for another shot." Lyria closed her eyes, her entire body glowing brighter than ever. The ship around her seemed to resonate with her energy, the walls vibrating as if alive. Ryan watched in awe and fear as she began to rise off the ground, her feet hovering inches above the floor. "Lyria," he called out, but she didn't respond. Her glowing eyes opened, and for a moment, she didn't look like the fragile alien he had saved. She looked like something far more powerful, far more terrifying. The warship's weapons fired again, but this time, the energy never reached them. A massive wave of light erupted from Lyria, spreading outward in all directions. It hit the incoming plasma bolts, disintegrating them mid-air. The wave continued, slamming into the enemy ships. The sacrifice. On the warship, alarms blared as systems overloaded and power failed. The smaller escort ships exploded instantly, their hulls unable to withstand the surge. The warship itself was crippled, its massive engines sputtering and dying. Inside, Varian watched helplessly as his prized fleet was torn apart. Back on the stolen ship, Lyria's glow began to fade. She collapsed to the floor, her breathing shallow. Ryan was at her side in an instant, cradling her in his arms. "Lyria, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled weakly. "Did we win?" Ryan nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, we won." Kale approached, their expression unusually somber. "She did it. The warship's dead in the water. They won't be chasing us anymore. But Ryan didn't care about the warship. He only cared about Lyria. Her glow was gone, her silver skin dull and cold to the touch. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice breaking. "You'll be fine." Lyria reached up, her fingers brushing his cheek. "Thank you for believing in me," she whispered. "You showed me. Not all humans are cruel." Her hand fell, and her eyes closed. Ryan held her close, his tears falling onto her lifeless skin. Cale placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "She saved all of us," they said quietly. "And if we're smart, we'll make sure her sacrifice wasn't for nothing." Ryan didn't respond. He just held Lyria, silently vowing that her death wouldn't be the end of her story. She had given everything to protect them, and he would make sure her legacy lived on. As the ship limped away from the battlefield, the icy planet fading into the distance, Ryan looked out at the stars. Lyria's light might have gone out, but her memory burned brighter than ever. A new beginning. The ship limped through the vast, star-speckled void. Its battered hull groaned with every shift in trajectory, but it kept moving. Ryan sat in the cockpit, staring at the endless expanse of space. His hands rested on the controls, but his mind was far away. Behind him, the faint hum of the ship's systems seemed louder in the empty silence that hung between him and Cale. Cale leaned against the wall, their visor off, revealing sharp, tired eyes. "We made it out alive," they said, their voice softer than usual. "That's more than I expected." Ryan didn't respond. His gaze flicked to the dim corner of the ship where Lyria lay, wrapped in a thermal blanket. Her silver skin had lost its glow entirely, and her fragile form seemed so small, so still. "She's gone, Ryan," Cale said, their tone cautious but firm. "You know that." Ryan shook his head. "She's not gone. Not yet." Cale sighed, pushing off the wall and stepping toward him. "Look, I get it. She was something else. She saved all of us. But you can't hold on to." "I'm not giving up," Ryan interrupted, his voice sharp. He turned to face Cale, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "There's still a chance. There has to be." Cale folded their arms, studying him. "And what exactly are you planning to do?" "Hope the universe throws you a miracle." Ryan stood, his fists clenched. "I don't need a miracle. I need a lead." He turned back to the console, pulling up the star map. "Lyria told me about her people, about the experiments Varen's forces did on them. They were designed to endure things no one else could. That means there's a chance she can recover." Cale raised an eyebrow. "And where exactly do you plan to find these answers?" Ryan zoomed in on a blinking icon on the map. "Here, the archive world." Lyria mentioned it once. She said it's where her people stored all their knowledge, before Varen's forces destroyed them. If there's a way to save her, it'll be there. Cale let out a low whistle. The archive world. That place is practically a myth. Even if it's real, it's deep in contested space. You'd be walking straight into enemy territory. Ryan's jaw tightened. "Then I'll walk." Cale studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You're insane, you know that." "Probably," Ryan said without hesitation. "Are you coming with me or not?" Cale smirked. "Like I'd missed the chance to see you get yourself killed. Besides, someone's got to keep you alive." The journey to the archive world was perilous. The ship barely held together as they navigated through asteroid fields and evaded enemy patrols. Cale's expertise as a bounty hunter proved invaluable, their sharp instincts and quick reflexes keeping them one step ahead of disaster. Ryan spent most of the journey by Lyria's side. He spoke to her softly, telling her stories about Earth, about the stars, about the life she had saved. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he hoped she could feel his presence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived. The archive world was unlike anything Ryan had ever seen. It floated in the void like a shattered jewel, its surface cracked and glowing with a strange ethereal light. Massive structures, remnants of a once thriving civilization, jutted out from the planet's surface, their intricate designs shimmering with faint energy. Kale whistled as they guided the ship toward the surface. Well, I'll be damned. It's real. Ryan's chest tightened with both hope and fear. Let's hope it's not too late. The archive. The air inside the archive was heavy, charged with ancient energy. Massive columns lined the walls, each one covered in glowing symbols that shifted and pulsed as if alive. Ryan carried Lyria in his arms, his steps echoing through the vast, empty halls. Kale followed closely, their plasma rifle at the ready. This place gives me the creeps, Kale muttered. Feels like it's watching us. Ryan ignored them, his focus on the central chamber ahead. As they entered, the room lit up, revealing a massive console surrounded by floating holograms. The symbols shifted, forming strange, incomprehensible patterns. What now? Kale asked, scanning the room. Ryan stepped forward, gently placing Lyria on a platform in the center of the chamber. As soon as he did, the holograms shifted again, their patterns becoming faster, more chaotic. The platform began to glow, and Ryan stepped back, his heart pounding. Come on, he whispered. Please work. The symbols on the console changed, forming a language Ryan couldn't understand. Kale stepped forward, tapping the device on their wrist. Translating, they said. After a moment, their eyes widened. It's scanning her. It's looking for something. What? Ryan asked. Kale pointed at the console. It says, Life Core Restorative Process activated, whatever that means. Suddenly, the platform lit up, and Lyria's body was engulfed in a cocoon of light. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as the light grew brighter, almost blinding. He shielded his eyes, his heart hammering in his chest. When the light finally faded, Ryan lowered his hand and froze. Lyria was standing in the center of the platform, her silver skin glowing brighter than ever. Her eyes opened, and they locked onto his. Ryan, she said, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it. You brought me back. Ryan rushed to her, his emotions overwhelming him. I thought I lost you, he said, his voice breaking. I couldn't lose you. She smiled, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude. You didn't. You saved me. Again. Kale cleared their throat, breaking the moment. Hate to interrupt, but we've got company. Ryan turned to see the holograms flashing red. An alarm blared, and Kel's visor lit up. Enemy ships incoming. We need to go. Now. Lyria stepped off the platform, her movements graceful and steady. Let's end this, she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Ryan nodded, his heart swelling with pride and hope. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would fight for a future worth living for.